Good evening, everybody. My name is Khaled Fahmy, and I'm the director of the Center for Islamic Studies here at the University of Cambridge. We're here to celebrate the publication of a wonderful small book, but profound book. Not a typical academic book in the sense that it comes not as a result simply of research in libraries and building on academic publications and academic research, but it is a book that is a product of a long journey of contemplation and reflection and a lot of hard work. What is amazing about this book, as I hope will become evident for those of you who haven't yet had the pleasure of reading it, is its combination of, as I said, hard work and discipline on the one hand, and passion. And this is not something that is easy to come by in any effort, for that matter, not only in academic books. I had the pleasure of meeting AHMED Keeler only when I came to this university 3 years ago, and over the past 2 years and in preparation for writing this book and after publishing it, we had many conversations about the book and about the journey that led into the book. I hope that some of the things that I want to touch upon in my brief introduction will become clear in the Q&A and in the discussion of the book. As I said, I am a recent comer arrival to Cambridge, and by talking to Ahmed, he tells me in many conversations about his upbringing, his long journey, and his final conversion to the very rich world of Islam. And these three trends are evident in this book. He tells me in many conversations how he was, in a sense, a member of the last generation in this country that was trained in a disciplined way to lead the empire, to run the empire. 10 years of boarding school, 10 years of serious preparation to carry this heavy, and to answer this calling. Not a member of the aristocracy, hence lacking the cynical distance that one can afford to have if one comes from this background, complementing it with serious, a deep sense of commitment, a deep sense of answering to a calling, and a deep sense of responsibility. Then comes the collapse of the empire and the discovery of the very rich and the immersion in the very rich world of the 1960s, of the Cultural Revolution, of music, of theater, of the avant-garde, of breaking taboos, of freeing oneself of the many of the taboos and the regulations of that earlier world. And then the last switch, the last turn, is the discovery of Islam, the very rich world of Islam, in which, in a very personal way, and I think it comes across, as I say, clearly in the book, there is an attempt to bring back order after things have kind of fallen apart, and to bring back balance, but with this passion that he had experienced in this very rich time of the 60s. I will not speak about the contents of the actual substantial arguments that are made in the many chapters of the book. I leave this to the speakers. But before introducing the speakers, I want to say something about the format of the event. I know most of you have not read the book, and it's always a very difficult task to discuss a book in a book launch when most of the people have not read the book. So what we have decided upon is to ask first the two speakers here on the stage to say a couple of words, and then we will ask some questions from the audience that I will call upon, just to break the monotony of many speeches from the podium, and then a further one or two questions, and then one last speaker, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. By that time, I hope that you will have had an idea of the many ideas that Paul is discussing in the book, and that you'll be able to engage with it. Of course, Ahmed will have a chance to also have a word or two in answer to the questions that will be posed. First speaker is Hasan Spiker, who spent 12 years studying the Islamic intellectual sciences in Morocco, Turkey, and Jordan, where he also completed his memorization of the Quran. During this time, he studied with a number of teachers, including the Iraqi sage Sayyid Qusay Abu Sa'id, one of the few remaining masters of the Ottoman and Kurdish Aqliyat curricula in their fullness, and an expert in the works of Ibn Arabi. A second-generation Anglo-American Muslim, Spiker holds a BA in philosophy from the University of London and has now begun an MPhil in theology here at the University of Cambridge.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Jürgen Habermas, one of the most famous philosophers of the last 50 years in the West, famously said that modernity is dead but dominant. I think the palpable sense of multiple and escalating crises, which increasingly now in many, many different areas of human personal and social and political and spiritual life, there's widespread acknowledgement of the reality of. This phenomenon of crises becomes readily understandable, because if something which is dead continues to be dominant and to dominate us, then clearly we're not receiving the vital life that we need to animate our institutions and our philosophies and so on. Of course, Jürgen Habermas himself is very much a modernist philosopher, and in the same article that he makes this statement, he's also calling for the renovation of modernity and the revivification of modernity in our time. But I think there's a general sense, increasingly acknowledged sense, that if we accept in some sense that modernity is on its last legs, it's because the narrative underlying it, which is that of progress, has lost its appeal and fundamentally is no longer believed in. And then its dominance seems to be explicable in terms of certain intellectual and political and social circumstances, which makes it very difficult to put ourselves in a situation where we can start to seriously think of an alternative. Tonight is so exciting, I think, because this is the book launch of something which genuinely offers an alternative. An alternative, a narrative, a principle which is more universal than progress. The doctrine of progress, which was exported around the world in the age of colonialism. A principle for judging the success of a civilization which can be found if we explore many great traditions around the world, not just that of Islam. But when we talk about the decline of Western civilization as the result of the loss of belief in that core doctrine, that of progress, I find this passage from Theodore Adorno's Minima Moralia, which was published in 1951, very, very poignant, because Theodor Adorno was writing during the Second World War, and previously a committed Hegelian. His thoughts represent someone whose faith in progress has been deeply shattered by events. So he says, just as in Nietzsche's time, when educated Philistines believed in progress, the uniformly higher development of the masses, and the greatest possible happiness of the greatest possible number, so too do they believe today, without quite knowing it, this is 1950s, in the opposite. The revocation of 1789, the incorrigibility of human nature, the anthropological impossibility of happiness, the profundity of yesteryear has recoiled into the most extreme banality. Nothing remains but the murkiest anti-intellectualism in the name of nature, which its apologists mutilate. And the prospects for progress seem little better now. Perhaps the last gasp for a revival of the doctrine of progress was Francis Fukuyama's famous paper or thesis, The End of History, where he, in the now comparatively idyllic 1990s, he described a universalization of Western liberal democracy as something that was kind of inevitable, and history had thus come to an end because, you know, the series of convulsions which constitute progress, to put it into a Hegelian framework, had just ceased to happen. We were now in an empty page of history because of the peace of the universality of liberal democracy. Now, two things put a spanner, I think, in this idea, and I don't think the end of history is taken particularly seriously anymore, in light of the events of 9/11 and the subsequent 2 decades. I think the reason that the doctrine was proved again and again to be wrong, especially insofar as it was supposed to describe humanity at large and supposed to be exported across the world, is because progress of all philosophies and doctrines is possibly the most idiosyncratically Western of them all. And this is because of the nature, really, of Western history and the development of Western history, intellectual and otherwise, because it's characterized by a series of violent ruptures and violent revolutions. Whether it's the Protestant Revolution or the French Revolution, and then intellectual revolutions, the Şentürk Revolution, the resultant Industrial Revolution. In, for example, the situation of the Protestant Revolution and the French Revolution, there is so much bloodshed and so much disruption of the social order, and so much fragmentation, in the case of the Protestant Revolution, of a previously unified Christian world, unified in religion, in language, and in scholastic culture, and so on. A way has to be found to justify those changes, justify the traumatic change, which assures people that things have somehow got better. So in Hegel's famous rendering of progress, for example, we have the idea that progress can only take place through lots of really nasty things happening, and people reacting to that bad situation and then finding a solution. And his idea was that we are getting ever and ever freer and ever more in touch with our individual subjectivity. And, you know, the assumption is this will eventually become universal if we correctly imitate the West, which represents that final stage of progress. Ahmed Keeler's core thesis, of course, is the way in which the doctrine of progress has infected the Muslim mind and fundamentally sullied Muslim faith in their own intellectual history and totally skewed, really, their understanding of their own past, reducing things to a kind of contribution to Western triumph rather than an own internal flourishing according to an internal principle. Theodor Adorno, who I just quoted, in fact converted from progress and from Hegelianism as a result of the Second World War. And his words in Minima Moralia are very moving. He says, millions of Jews have been murdered, and on the idea of progress through terrible events happening, and this is to be seen as an interlude and not the catastrophe itself. If that's taken place, then what next? What's the next thing which is going to be the agent of progress? What more is this culture waiting for, he said. In a multicultural world of mounting, escalating crises, when we're simultaneously very aware of cultural differences and very aware of the impact of a monoculture of mostly spread by the universalization of Western models of education and so on, there's an enormous amount of tension which is only escalating. And I think it's very clear that what is needed, and this is often acknowledged this is not some sort of esoteric insight. I mean, if you read the pages of the New Statesman, there's a lot of this type of thing. What is needed is a narrative which is more universal than progress. And this is what I genuinely think AHMED Keeler provides in this book. A serious alternative to the doctrine of progress, which immediately makes sense of the Muslim past far more clearly than trying to fit into the doctrine of Western triumph can possibly ever offer, and indeed makes sense of the Western world in terms of an understanding of why, if the fundamental principles of liberal secularism are so wonderful, we are in this situation of ever-mounting and increasingly widely acknowledged personal and social and political crises. I'd like to read from the preface of Ahmed's book. He says, "Central to my book is the idea that we are now living in the age of crises, and have been since the creation of the atom bomb. The ever-present reality that we can destroy ourselves and all life on Earth in multiple ways hovers over our existence. In the following pages, the attempt is made to understand how we have arrived in this age of crises, and to untangle the confusion and hostility that now exists between Islam and the West. In order to do this, we are proposing a change of perspective, a different narrative and set of criteria. The narrative which powers the modern world is that of progress, and it has gathered up all of history in its wake. Islam and pre-modern cultures and civilizations are viewed through this prism. However, the idea of progress belongs uniquely to the West. It makes little sense when applied to Islam and pre-modern societies. We propose in the following pages to replace the criterion of progress with that of balance, a central principle in Islamic civilization, and indeed an essential precondition for the sustainability of any culture or civilization. Our age of crises can be seen as a result of the loss of balance that has taken place in our modern way of life, the balance between the material and the spiritual, and between ourselves and the environment in which we live." And I hope that you'll all, if you don't already have one, be able to pick up a copy of the book as you leave. And what you will find within is an exposition, a comparative exposition of Western and Islamic history, an elucidation of this concept of balance, which takes in several different kind of agents of balance and principles of balance. So you'll find terms like the mereological principle, the ontological triad, the Platonic triad, the vocational triad, are principles which arrive from a deep appreciation of Islamic thought and Islamic history and Western history, and which are principles of balance, areas of human life where a type of balance needs to be achieved, which I think very genuinely correspond to the intellectual life and the social life of Islamic civilization. The Platonic triad, for example, that became deeply integrated into both all the great monotheisms, not monotheisms really, but very eminently in the case of Islam, the idea that moral action involves a balancing of the faculty of intellect, the faculty of spiritedness or anger, and the faculty of desire, such that they all become subordinated, not negated, but subordinated to the intellect. And the idea of the golden mean, also very deeply integrated into Islamic civilization, such that commentators would typically find both of these principles in the Quran. And I'll leave you to discover these beautiful principles for yourself. But in the meantime, I'd like you all to join me in congratulating Sidi Ahmed and thanking him for his invitation to this beautiful event. Thank you very much.
Second speaker is Professor Recep Şentürk. Dr. Şentürk is the president of the Ibn Khaldun University in Istanbul in Turkey. He holds a PhD from the Department of Sociology of Columbia University and specializes in civilizational studies, sociology, and Islamic studies with a focus on social networks, human rights, and modernization in the Muslim world. Among his books are, in English, The Narrative Social Structure, Hadith Transmission Networks from 1610 to 1500, and in Turkish, Open Civilization Towards a Multi-Civilizational Society and World, Ibn Khaldun, Contemporary Readings, Malcolm X Struggle for Human Rights.
I would like to begin with what Hasan's speaker ended, congratulating AHMED Paul Keeler for this wonderful work and thanking him for offering such a book to us, especially in a period when we have books about Islam only from security perspective. Islam is seen as a threat, or tried to be shown as a threat to humanity, or Islam is seen as a subject of historical study, historicized. So Islam belongs to a bygone era. So here we see a book. It's about what Islam has to offer to humanity. It has a very different perspective. It's about future. What Islam and Muslims have to offer to humanity, have to contribute to humanity. So what's our promise to humanity? So Islam is seen on the rise in Europe and in America. Some people perceive it as a threat. And it's understandable because there's a group on the rise. But this group should tell the community how they will contribute to the community in Europe and in America, in other parts of the world. So I see AHMED Paul Keeler's work in this context. So it's a very good contribution. Who are Muslims and how they approach the West, and what kind of contribution that they can make to the problems of humanity, that they care about the world, they care about the humanity. They are not like self-enclosed. They don't care only about Muslims, and they are not interested only in finding solutions to the problems of the Muslim community, but they care about the world. So this approach, in my view, is genuinely Islamic approach, because from the very beginning, Muslims cared about the whole world, and the message of Prophet Muhammad was to the whole humanity, not just to Arabs, not just to Muslims, to the whole world. And Muslims, when they expanded their rule around the world, and they brought peace and prosperity to India, to Central Asia, to Balkans, and to rest of the world. But the Muslim mode Muslim mind got closed during the 20th century, perhaps under the influence of nationalist, secularist, modernist ideologies. They started thinking about only their country, their nation, and the largest they could get this the Muslim community. So this was a deviation from the Islamic thinking through ages. So I see the book as an answer to the following question: what's the problem with the world today, and what's the way out? And the answer has historical and metaphysical depth. So this is the distinctive quality of that answer, because other people also ask the same question, but they answer without historical depth, without metaphysical depth, without moral depth. This answer has, this distinctive quality of rootedness in history, metaphysics, and morality. So I agree with the diagnosis that the problems we suffer today in the world may be traced back to the ideology of progress, because the ideology of progress is used as a tool to other some societies, non-Western societies, because they are far away from progress. They have no progress. The most they could be included, they contributed somehow in the history, maybe during Middle Ages, to the progress. Then they are left behind. The China, the India, the Africa, Latin America, the Muslims, they lag behind. So they are not part of the progress. This ideology is used to other and excludes rest of the world from the West and create a gap. So basically it is used as a tool to exclude the rest of the world from the goodness that the West enjoys. They are deprived from it, and also tell to the whole world how nice we are, how beautiful we are, how intelligent we are, and how stupid you are, how lazy you are, how ugly you are. So this is the pragmatics of the discourse of progress. And to complement it, another discourse is produced, discourse of decline. So all other civilizations declined. So two narratives, progress narrative and the decline narrative, they complemented each other. A progress narrative is produced to ground the superiority of the West, and another narrative of decline, to ground the backwardness of the rest of the world. AHMED Keeler demonstrates that progress narrative and decline narrative does not reflect the truth about the West, nor does it reflect the truth about the non-Western world. It's a narrative which is not really grounded in the historical facts, in particular regarding the Middle Ages. So Middle Ages does not represent the dark ages. There was, great art, philosophy, morality, and also, social solidarity in that time. So the dialectic which we use, to produce our narrative about what's happening in the world, what's wrong with the world, and the solution should not be based on progress and decline. It should be based on balance and imbalance, equilibrium and disequilibrium, justice and injustice. And actually, this was the narrative used before the rise of modernity in all cultures of the world, from China to India to Islam and to Christian Europe. This was the commonly shared view that the balance, the world runs on balance. This is like the single law that's applicable at the philosophical level, social level, and also individual psychological level. And Ahmed Keeler demonstrates this, by using the ontological triad, that the balance is established in the worldview, unseen, human, and material worlds, and at the societal level, about the different vocational groups, scholars, priests, rulers, merchants, the balance among these groups in society, and also in individual level, in human psychology, between intelligence, desire, and anger. The purpose is to reach this dynamic equilibrium, which is not easy to achieve, which is not easy to sustain. But this equilibrium is presented in the progress discourse as stagnation and decline. But in reality, it is not stagnation, because reaching this dynamic equilibrium is not easy. It's at the psychological level, societal level, and also at the conceptual level. So in Islamic tradition, it is accepted that at the individual, family, and also state level, balance is the law to reach peace and prosperity. So the Islamic practical philosophy, al-hikmat al-amaliyya, accepts that self-management, tadbir al-nafs, requires balance in human psychology, and tadbir al-manzil, management of the house and the family, requires balance in the family, and also managing the state, tadbir al-madina, requires balance. And this balance, not only at the individual, family, and state level, but also the whole world. God's creation, the whole universe, is also based on balance. So this is what Ahmed Keeler calls mizan. Mizan is the balance, it's the justice, it's the equilibrium at all these levels. So the way God runs the world, based on balance, we should run our own selves, our families, and also our states. And balance is also a good tool of diversity management, diversity management system. So today, we talk about pluralism, democracy, and managing diversity. And diversity is increasing in the world due to fast development in communication and transportation. So we need a diversity management system, and traditionally, especially in the Islamic system, it was based on balance between different schools of thought, ethnic groups, classes, interests. So this is what's needed to be revived today, to diagnose what's wrong in our world. So the answer is no balance, no equilibrium, because balance is disdained, it's not progress. So we need to go back to what the so-called pre-modern civilizations adopted, but they did not destroy the world. But we, in 200 years or 300 years, we destroyed everything in the world, and even the future of the globe is at risk today due to this ideology of progress. So we need to reconsider it and critically analyze it. And I thank Paul Keeler, offering us an alternative answer to what's wrong in our world and what's the way out to it. And his great contribution is that he avoids and shows us how to avoid false dichotomies, between traditional and the modern, between intellect and religion, secular and religious. So there are many false dichotomies from which, like, modern thought suffers. So he's saying, these are false dichotomies. We can bring them together in a balanced way, in a harmony. So thank you very much.
Dr. Cornwall is a senior research associate from here, Jesus College, executive director of the Science and Human Dimension Project, specializing in human intelligence.
Yes, in your chapter on knowledge, you discuss the unintended consequences of scientific research and its application, giving examples, a number of examples, including plastics, CFCs, penicillin, and artificial intelligence. And with reference to scientific research, you also talk about the dangers of delving too deep into subjects. So my question is really, can I assume you're not advocating closing down research here in Cambridge or elsewhere? And if so, where do you see the balance? What is the way forward?
I had a wonderful morning with Johnny at our home, because what has been going on over the last months is that we've been having conversations with people who have read the book. Because when we had this gathering, I wanted to have questions which had come about through people really going into the book and then giving me problems to answer. And when he came up with this one, my first reaction was, I'm not going to go into that. And then I started to think, well, actually, it's a very important and pertinent question. He was basically saying to me, in fact, you put it to me even more bluntly than that. You put it to me, is the book proposing that we should close down all the laboratories in Cambridge? Having, of course, I've said in the book that the modern world has practically come out of this institution of Cambridge. Cambridge has been the most powerful centre for the creation of the modern world, probably on the planet. Harvard has got more Nobel Prizes now, but it wasn't back, 20, 30 years ago. How am I to answer this? I feel it's a question that basically is a bit like if you are King Canute and you are standing on the shore and you decide that the waves should not come in. You say, stop. The book doesn't say that, because the book, in no sense, I think, takes upon itself to look into the future in terms of how the crisis we're in will unfold. Very little of it. Why? Because we don't know, we can't see the plan. And because the investment in the creation of this modern world is so vast. And it has already reached such a huge stage. Just think of the last 10 years, how it's grown. And the problem with modernity is that it only keeps alive by growing. It has to grow in order to remain alive. And the growth is so immense. Look at the University of Cambridge. It's having to create new departments all the time in the sciences to keep that process of development continuing. Go into that beautiful principle, coming out of the concept of al-mizan, of balance, which is the deeper you go into matter, the greater are the forces that are released. And we know what happened when the atom was broken, split, the atom bomb. And now the process in CERN of going deeper and deeper into matter, and you get all the unintended consequences. There is no question of these stopping what's happening. Because if you stop it, which you can't, it collapses. Our world collapses. Our modern world, which I call in the book a cult, because a cult is something which doesn't connect into heaven and doesn't connect onto the earth. It's like a world which is, this whole mechanical world is a kind of dream that has come out of the rational mind. And it doesn't make any sense, because it doesn't connect into nature, as we see. But most important of all, it doesn't connect into the heavens. There's a beautiful statement, which I quote in the book, of the wonderful Catholic historian, Christopher Dawson, said back in the 1930s. He said, modernity, this world that we're creating, modern man is cut off from the heavens and he's cut off from the earth. He's in this kind of in-between world of his own creation. So it's not something that I even contemplate. What I do see is two things happening in Cambridge. And I'm just looking at what's taking place. One is that there are whole groups of scientists, half the research scientists, are dealing with the problems that have been created by the unintended consequences. In medicine, in terms of global warming, you've got the Antarctic Survey, and they're all dealing with the problems. They're trying to solve the problems that have emerged, which are immense. And they are telling us, week by week, the terrible dangers that are facing us. Every week there's something new in medicine or in genetics or in any, all the different areas. And they're telling us this. And they've set up in Cambridge the Centre for the Study of Existential Risks, Sir Martin Rees. The other side of the research endeavour is to go deeper and deeper into matter to produce the next generation of unintended consequences. And these are going to be of a level which is going to make the atom bomb appear quite cuddly. So this is what I see. In terms of a solution, I wasn't intending in the book to even think of that. I was just observing the fact that these two things are happening. But also, what is very interesting is there is a movement of the scientists which is away from the abyss, trying to draw back from it in many areas. But the problem is not, we can't solve the problems by dealing with global warming, putting up screens, all this kind of ideas they have. And the future, believe you me, is not going to be one where the robot suddenly turns into this cyborg, which is going to take us into a new world of, and you agree with this. The reality is that the world we have created, we've created it. God created man, man created the machine. He broke sacred time, sacred space, sacred relationships. He created his own creation, which is this machine, out of the limited aspect of the rational mind, divorced from its glorious relationships with the mystical mind, with the senses, with the God-centeredness. And what we now see, this chaos, this ugliness, the phenomenal ugliness that we are faced with every moment of our lives, is the reflection of our souls. It is a mirror to what we are, what we have become. That's the really frightening part of it. So unless there is a transformation of our souls, There is nothing, all of this kind of trying to stop things from the outside, trying to deal with, existential things, is I would have suggested from a principial point of view, is doomed to failure.
So I think if we can move to Muhammad Musa, and who before joining Cambridge's PhD in law program, he had earned an NLM from Harvard Law School as a Fulbright scholar.
Thanks, sir, for this wonderful book, and I hope that Mizan will soon replace GDP as an indicator of wealth of nation, but as an indicator of health of civilization. But as I read the book, I realized that Mizan is something that a civilization has to work to maintain. So my question is, could it be that for Muslims, Mizan was lost from the inside, from within, prior to and independently from the rise of modernity? And in such a case, the domination of Western ideal and the concurrent and inferiority complex of catch-up narrative was more of a consequence rather than a root cause. So reading the book seems to explain this very wonderful idea of Mizan, but does not apply the idea when explaining the collapse of the Ottoman Empire or the collapse of the Mughal Empire. It seems to take the fall for granted without explaining if Mizan was lost from within, maybe possibly prior to any military or intellectual shock. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a very, very important question, because the idea that the Islamic world collapsed from within is one which I believe comes first of all from when Muslims were traumatized by this absolute huge thing that came from outside and destroyed something that had existed for more than 1,000 years in a state of stability. And I'm talking about social stability. I'll come to the question of the regimes in a minute, the dynasties. The first thing that a Muslim would say, it's my fault. You would blame yourself. This is very natural. Actually, what is remarkable about Islamic civilization is that, first of all, it is the only universal civilization. There can only be one universal. It spread from Arabia through to China and all the way across to West Africa. And it embodied all the different peoples and nations. And unlike, say, the Roman civilization or the Chinese civilization, which was utterly dependent upon the dynasty, when the Chinese emperor fell, it was chaos until it was reinstated, and the state was its. When the Roman Empire fell, it all fell. That world fell. With Islam, dynasties came and went, hundreds of them, because the relationship, the whole structure of Islamic civilization was not dependent upon the dynasty. The dynasty had a role to play, but the stability and the power of the civilization was within the whole Sharia culture education system, the world maintained by the scholars. So the important thing is that it was the great civilization of the Sharia and of the educational structure and of the arts. The senses, when you come to this wonderful trilogy of the mystical cognition, the reasoning mind, and the senses, the three ways we can comprehend, the three ways we understand the world. And in this God movement which took place within Islam, the senses, the knowledge of the senses is realized through the artist. They are the wise ones of the senses because they have heightened senses. And the environment that they created, the Islamic environment from West Africa through to China, the environment was unified. And the environment manifested unity. the geometric form, the structures. And then you have the whole question of the traditional mystical, the whole Sufic aspect. And then you have the reasoning mind, which Hasan Spiker has done fantastic work on tracing how that reasoning mind in Islam did not go AWOL like it did in the West, where it took off on its own. It reached that point of glorious conviction and clarity, because all of these three capacities for knowledge, for understanding, were directed towards receiving the revelation, of understanding the revelation. Now, that world, the inheritors of the Prophet were the scholars. And that was where the power of Islamic civilization lay. And dynasties came to do their job, maintain certain orders, and they went. But the civilization continued on. And that civilization, that world, was intact right up until the 19th century. It was operative. It was able to take certain of the stresses and strains. But when the Industrial Revolution happened, and when the whole development in Europe took place, and when Europe descended into the world of the Chthonic principle of going deep into matter, of releasing powers, of developing powers which were beyond anything that you could develop if you were maintaining mizan, nothing could withstand the power of them. Nothing. The power, it's like, you just think of it, going from fighting with bows and arrows, swords, chivalry, to the atom bomb. The scale is completely different. And that is because by breaking the mereological principle of balance, by going down into the chthonic realm, you create an aberration of monstrous capacity, because this material reality, or appearance of reality, you claim to be the whole. And once you claim a part to be the whole, you produce an aberration. And that's what happened, and nothing could stand. People say to me about this thing, what? I say, look, if you're playing by the rules, you have a boxing match, and at the end of round 5, the guy comes out for the 6th round, and instead of his boxing, he's got a machine gun. He's not playing by the rules. And that is the important. So this mereological principle, which is the part can contain, the whole can contain the parts, but the part cannot contain the whole. And immediately the part claims to contain the whole, you get an aberration. And that is the basis of the whole of the creation of the modern world. The gentleman who came here some months ago that you invited, Wael Halak, in his book, The Impossible State, has beautifully enunciated this. It's a beautiful description of this whole structure.
So if I can call upon Dr. Arafat Razzaque, who is one of our own research associates in the Center for Islamic Studies, who got his PhD from Harvard University. He specializes in classical Islamic thought and the social and cultural history of the medieval Middle East. His current research lies in the areas of piety and asceticism in early Islamic tradition, religious and social ethics, and ideas of kinship and the history of the family.
Thank you, Khaled, for that introduction. I hesitate to come up here when I know many of you have questions, and we would like to very much continue this engaging discussion. but I was asked to share some thoughts on the book as a student of history. So I would firstly like to thank Ahmed Paul Keeler for very graciously extending this opportunity to me. I will try to keep it brief. Let me begin with a quote from George Orwell, which was the opening of an essay that he wrote, that he first delivered on BBC Eastern Service in 1942. It was called The Rediscovery of Europe. So it's a moment that goes back to the end of empire that Khaled was describing, and that's something that I've also had the pleasure and the privilege of hearing from Sidi Ahmed himself. So I quote, Orwell writes, "When I was a small boy and was taught history, very badly of course, as nearly everyone in England is, I used to think of history as a sort of long scroll with thick black lines ruled across it at intervals. Each of these lines marked the end of what was called a period, and you were given to understand that what came afterwards was completely different from what had gone before. It was almost like a clock striking. For instance, in 1499, you were still in the Middle Ages, with knights in plate armor riding at one another with long lances, and then suddenly the clock struck 1500, and you were in something called the Renaissance." Moving on later, he says there was another very thick black line drawn at the year 1700. After that, it was the 18th century, and people suddenly became extraordinarily elegant gentlemen in knee breeches and three-cornered hats, and so on and so forth. The whole of history was like that in my mind, a series of completely different periods changing abruptly at the end of a century, or at any rate at some sharply defined date. So Orwell is basically rejecting this notion of abrupt transitions and periods of history, what Golden Age, or the Renaissance, or the medieval, or the Middle Ages. And I begin with this quote because I think it relates to one of really the central premises of Keeler's book, and in fact his starting point, as he outlines in his introduction. I'll quote again briefly here from the book itself. Those wishing to defend Islam, both Westerners and Muslims, invoke the golden age of Islam and the contribution that Muslims made during the European Dark Ages to the creation of the modern world. But this opens the door to detractors who ask, what have they contributed since? Moving on later, he says, this narrative has been so powerful for so long that even educated Muslims have completely bought into it, accepting the idea that Islam has become a tributary feeding into the mainstream of modern civilization. Its value is now judged purely in terms of what Europe received from it. However, he says, he will argue that the Golden Age thesis shuts out the understanding of what actually happened and has caused great confusion in the Muslim mind, end quote. Now, historians claim to be in the business of knowing what actually happened. And so I wanted to kind of just very briefly share why I think this is a pretty accurate observation, that the notion of the golden age of Islam is indeed incredibly attractive. It appeals both to Muslims and to many peoples in the West. But from both perspectives, it's really flip sides of the same coin. And that is explaining the status of the West as we know it today. The thing is, this way of thinking is actually ahistorical, I would argue, for two reasons. One, scholars of Islamic history, especially Islamic intellectual history, have come to recognize this as a pretty skewed and myopic perspective, because it ignores the history of what one might call the mature Islamic civilizations. Certainly the Ottomans, the Timurids, the Safavids, and the Mughals. All of these empires sponsored sort of huge and vast projects of intellectual, philosophical, scientific enterprise. Secondly, to view one period or another through this kind of a value judgment is not really the business of historians, because I think our task is to examine particular developments or changes over time and try to offer explanations. How do we understand such changes over time? More crucially, what this means is that you can't really subscribe to a view, so what the historians' kind of realization in recent decades, that this is not the way to treat history fairly, it means that you can't really subscribe to a view of some kind of overarching progress or of decline, on which we have heard quite a bit so far this evening. Now, this is at least where mainstream academic history stands, and much of scholarship in recent decades has been written to counteract earlier narratives that were popular, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. Now, the one reason why approaching a particular period of history in this manner is problematic is that it prevents you from understanding a past society on its own terms, right? Instead, you view a period as classical or in the middle, right? The Middle Ages, or the Renaissance, only because you reduce that period of history to its relation to some other period of history, right? Now, of course, periodization matters, and so we can't entirely dismiss the scroll that Orwell was describing, because we have to rely on some kind of a mental map and to sort of organize how we understand, or even to focus on a particular place and time to study, to pursue sort of our study of history. But the point is that I think that another reason why I think that the Orwell quote is interesting is because most people actually don't think that way in that sense of periods of history, black lines dividing one period from another. Because I think that for many people, those markers between time periods actually dissolve into a sort of a sense of timeless past, what you might just call old times. It's a very sort of, if you're, if you go somewhere as a tourist and you'll see restaurants sort of, claiming to be, or various landmarks, right, sort of trying to attract tourists. And the general sense is from some time really way back in the past. There's little sort of differentiation. And I find that interesting. So in some ways, I think that as historians, one of the reasons why we tend to sort of focus is to try to really, again, as I said, understand a society on its own terms rather than in relationship to some kind of grand and overarching narrative. Conclude with really one of the main questions that I think that the book raises for me. Having said all this on our notion of the past and our notion of periods in the past, which are ultimately our own projections, our impositions on history. By rejecting the notion of a golden age of Islam, or let's say a classical Islam period of Islam, are we in some ways simply redefining it? In other words, are we simply extending the duration of the golden age of Islam to include, let's say, the Ottomans? Or are we simply shifting from, let's say, from Abbasid Baghdad to Ottoman Istanbul in the 16th century as the true golden age, where we find most works of philosophy and things like that? And I ask this because I see this as an increasingly common tendency, especially in the current climate of certain intellectual trends, including post-colonial thought, so-called decolonizing knowledge, a tendency to treat the entirety of history before the Western encounter, the rupture of Western modernity, as a kind of timeless past. So this is the question that I have as a student of history. But really, for me, again, what Paul Keeler's book shows is the imperative to study history. If we're genuinely interested in the history of Muslim societies before the ruptures of modernity, I think we're obliged to actually study that history in all its details, in all its messiness, in all its depth, and in all its complexity and its richness, as comes across very clearly in this small book. So, thank you.
Dr. Samir Mahmoud, who has a PhD in philosophical aesthetics from Cambridge. He's actively engaged in the research on the phenomenology of architecture, space and the senses, architectural history, and the theory of the Gothic and the Renaissance. He's here from Beirut, I am told, who he had to pass through, I mean, of course, I don't know whether you know what's happening in Beirut. There's a revolution, full-blown revolution in Beirut and elsewhere in Lebanon, and he had to pass through 9 roadblocks on the way to the airport to come, especially for this event. So thanks for coming.
I'd like to thank Ahmed Prof. Keeler, of course, for inviting me and taking this opportunity to really present what my take away from this book. My take from the book is, sitting in a cafe, I like cafes and I drink a lot of coffee, and thinking of Islam and the West as two individuals in a dialogue. Islam and the West walk into a cafe and have a dialogue. And that's how the conversation really unfolded in my mind. I think the book really achieves a number of things that, given that I'm the last speaker, perhaps it might be useful for me to summarize these, and it could be a useful takeaway. Reading the title, Rethinking Islam and the West, I think the first number of things that the book achieves in regards to the West, at least, is, number one, it offers a story or a narrative other than the one that we're familiar with or have been familiar with for the past few centuries. It shows, unveils, reveals a middle age, an alternative path, an alternative world, other modalities of being, other ways of existing in this world that were once quite common and dominant, and that are not beyond the pale of revival or being reclaimed. And he does this by showing that some of the major developments that lead from that particular moment, we call the Middle Ages, to the modern world, are developments in which, to borrow a term from someone I was conversing with today, developments that dismantle the Middle Ages rather than disprove its validity or its viability. And by showing step by step how this edifice was dismantled, he reveals and shows that possibilities that it was not inevitable. And nor is it the norm or standards for measuring civilization. And I think this is a really important one. Teaching architecture and art, measuring progress by stylistic periods serves or has no rational or legitimate justification whatsoever other than ideological commitments to different styles and to different changes. By showing that many of the developments of the modern world are not standards of progress necessarily, nor are they standards of measurement for assessing and evaluating other civilizations. He's showing that the West so far, at least since the birth of the modern world, is not normative. And this, I think, is really, really important because both Westerners and Muslims take for granted the normative criteria of modern civilization, whether we're talking about principles of economic progress, or whether we're talking about what it means to be a dignified human being in the modern world, or whether it means what our relationship to the natural world is. He dismantles each and every one of these by showing that they are indeed not normative. More importantly, I think for Muslims, more so than anyone else, he shows that these so-called polar opposites that seem like opposites in the book, but not really, are not geographical. The West and Islam are not two geographical regions, at least not today, not my generation. They are really polar sides of the same individual. At least in my mind, I am both somehow Westerner and modern, and at the same time quite Islamic and Muslims. And I think every Muslim can relate to these bipolar phenomenon, as it were. It is quite a psychological problem, where these two polar opposites kind of struggle within each and every one of us. So the book is really also a dialogue between both sides of our own existential topography. On the Islamic side of things, I think by showing that there's another narrative in the West, and that it is recoverable in many ways, and that its developments are not inevitable nor normative, and that somehow they exist through globalization within each and every one of us. That is important, at least from the Islamic perspective, to start comparing like with like. Because if the Western civilization is not the standard and not normative, then we can't, as Muslims at least, keep on trying in the attempt to elevate some Islamic thinkers and modernize them, compare individuals or thinkers that are not alike at all. And often, more often than not, you find people comparing Ibn Arabi and Derrida, or Nietzsche and Hafiz, or Ushered Kalam with David Hume. Although there are similarities, it is important to recognize that they are quite fundamentally different. And this is achieved by recovering what I would call Islamic categories of being. Recovering Islamic categories of being is a process by which one really truly tries to understand the ontological categories of Islamic civilization and its intellectual tradition on its own terms, and then reversing the mirror and showing how, from perhaps this perspective, what would the narrative of progress look like? Not necessarily in a judgmental way, not necessarily in a dismissive way, but by juxtaposing these two positions and the two perspectives, a very interesting perspective emerges. And by the end of the book, I felt like one wasn't left with the message of despair, but rather with a challenge. Because one of the fundamental things I think about Islamic civilization, at least the way I have understood the traditional framework, is that well, if you're looking at it from what I call the Islamic category of being, time and history is not some kind of inevitable march, which is something that can't be resisted or can't be reversed. Islamic civilization is more described in the spatial terms, I think. The spatial metaphor is quite powerful. Islam has and emphasizes this notion of presence. So the very principles, the very reality upon which traditional civilization is based, literally beyond this veil of the material world, ever present to each and every one of us. And so the choice of recovering some of these traditional principles is not so much reaching back into the past necessarily, but rather accepting and realizing that there are other dimensions to this very reality, and rising to the challenge of making the existential choice of re-embracing them. And so, as one great scholar once said, the past isn't behind us, it's literally beneath our feet or above us, in the sense that it's a spatial thing. It doesn't require, you can't go back in time. You don't have to. And so, in this sense, one escapes what Liade calls the terror of history, and is, through this existential choice, is able to recover the very fundamental principles that I think are laid out and opened up through various perspectives and horizons in the book. At least that was my take from the book, and I think I'm basing a new seminar that I'm giving in Sydney, Australia, on this book because of its popularity. A lot of people have purchased the book and read it, and it's opened up so many horizons that it's required now several seminars to really unfold the content of the book that you've just sometimes in some chapters touched upon but haven't elaborated on. So thank you very much, and thank you for the audience. I hope I kept to my 5 minutes. Thanks.
Whilst we might aspire towards Mizan as an ideal, does history in general, and the fate of the Islamic world in particular, not allow us that a civilization which is operating according to Mizan cannot compete militarily or economically with a society which is functioning according to the progress paradigm? In a society in Mizan ultimately doomed to be vanquished by a more dynamic, innovative society which develops more powerful weapons and is capable of extracting more wealth from its resources? Yes. As I think, there's no question. That's the reality. The reality is that the minute you break the mereological principle and you enter, you break the balance and you enter into the power of materiality, that power will provide you with the conquest of, you may conquer the whole world and lose your soul. It's something like that, isn't it? One of the beautiful things. But the reality is that what I tried to do in this book was not actually to predict the future or to actually put up any solutions about what you should do in the future. My concern was simply a matter of clarity. if we don't understand the nature of what modernity is, and if we do not understand what Islamic civilization was, we are living in a fog. So it was purely the idea of trying to understand the reality of our situation. Because unless you know that reality of our situation, you don't know how to go forward. You don't know how to act. You're in a state of contradiction, or you're in a state of confusion, as our dear friend was saying. You know, this is how we've been living. We're in a state of contradiction. The contradiction, the continuous contradiction of our lives saps us of the capacity to act. And we're all in our little departments, producing beautiful things. But we need to have, you see, the postmodernism, I had to get onto this. I mean, you know, Foucault, our friend Foucault everywhere. Foucault here, Foucault there, Foucault everywhere. You know, this horrifying disintegration of all knowledge, everything becoming relative, has meant that we're in a position where we can't any longer see the grand narrative. And there is a grand narrative. And that's what I'd hoped to try to have shown in this book, is that there is a grand narrative, but that narrative belongs to him, not to us. And that's why the whole immense, huge crisis that we're going through, the immense destruction that we're experiencing of nature, of human societies, of states, this is of a scale that goes beyond the human. Historians can never explain it. They can't explain this to the thing. Something amazing happened, which was misread when this whole new thing started to evolve. And that is the thing. So I'm not really, it's to understand modernity for what it really is, because modernity now is on its, everything in creation goes up and down. You know, when we're talking about the dynasties, they come and they go. And this experiment that went through, this human experiment, which has taken the soul and completely changed the whole of structure of our being, went up like a rocket. And I'm afraid that, as far as I can understand, and certainly the scientists are telling us this, it's on its way down. And so we're faced with this crisis. And the only way, the only value of this book is simply to, as you said when you said to me, which is the loveliest remark, it's thought-provoking. Well, it's trying to shake us out of the norm, because what we have done is we have normalized the abnormal. We've normalized the abnormal. So we can't any longer see the normal. Once you normalize the abnormal, you cannot see the normal. It becomes distorted. So that's the purpose of the book. I have no idea what's going to happen. It's his show. We're just players. Aren't we?
I wondered if you promote a mizan between the West and Islam, these two personalities, as your previous speaker spoke about, coming to a coffee table, whether you're looking for a balance between the West and Islam as an ultimate mizan.
I think the ultimate mizan was already produced. And I think that's, again, very important in this book. The ultimate mizan took place when the revelation of Islam, the Islamic revelation, which took 23 years to be manifested. 23 years for the whole revelation to come down to humanity. And then, step by step, it realized itself in the world as this stable civilization which took human beings from the cradle to the grave, through all the different processes of life, in a world that was in a state of mizan. The institutions represented that. The institutions embodied it, made it possible. And that, when the one, the unity, is revealed, there is nothing else that can happen. That is why Islam is the last of the revelations. You can't have a balance between a world that is dynamically breaking the balance, and today, at the moment in time, the Islamic world, in terms of its civilization, is fragmented just like every other civilization, just like our own Christendom. It's all shattered. But as I say in the book, and has been mentioned, in terms of Islam, the sacred core, that which was established during the lifetime of the Prophet ﷺ, is completely intact. It's totally operative. In whatever way, the spiritual relationship with God at this time is the important thing. And in all the different traditions, there are ways to find that. If you are standing on a beach and there is a tsunami coming, and you see it out in the sea, what do? You don't analyze and say, what is this thing? You go for high ground. You take refuge from it. And the whole basis of my book is on the realization or the perception, which is now common, that we are facing a crisis which is unique. Humanity has never faced anything like this before. And it is ever present. And it is eating into all our lives. It's going into our families. It's eating into the world of our children. Our children are worried. Our children are having mental problems. This is appalling. Childhood should never have been like this. So you can't balance the West with Islam. It's impossible. These two worlds have two completely different dynamics.
Living in the West and in the age of crisis, as you described it, what is it that gives you strength in continuing on living the good life, living in balance in a personal way, with helping your family?
Islam is so rich, and also people are so rich. Relationships are the most important thing. They have to be nourished. And this is the world where everything now has been, we can't see, we have to make appointments to see people. We're talking to people through these funny little things. That's why I really appreciated the time you gave me when you came to my house, and we had time to talk, to begin to get to know each other. It was wonderful, alhamdulillah. Anyway, this is for me, how I pass my time. And I'm now getting ancient. So, of course, that relationship which the grandfather has with the grandchildren, this is very beautiful, because that's the completion of the circle. They are teaching us, because they have just come from Almighty Allah, they are teaching us how to be in the present, outside of time. Because when we get old, we have to return to Almighty Allah, and we have to be in a state where we're in the present. Because otherwise it's a very bumpy ride. Isn't that right?
Yes.
I think on that beautiful note, we have to bring this beautiful session to a close. I know many of you still have questions, but I hope we will have an opportunity outside in the foyer where there are more books to be signed and bought. So please join me in thanking Ahmed Keeler for writing this book and for being with us tonight.